Detective Sarah Collins had been tracing unusual money flows for months, and forensic accountant James Patel was convinced something was hidden in plain sight. Liverpool's waterfront had always carried a sense of quiet power. The river moved steadily, ferries passed like clockwork, and the old buildings stood as witnesses to centuries of trade and struggle. One structure in particular drew the eye without demanding attention. For years the building had changed roles without losing its identity. Offices became storage rooms became workspaces, and some areas were sealed off entirely. Layers of history stacked on top of each other, leaving behind narrow gaps, unused shafts, and forgotten service routes. The first sign of trouble came far from the waterfront. A routine review of financial activity flagged several small deposits made across different parts of the city. Each deposit alone meant nothing. Together they formed a rhythm that felt planned. The money never stayed long. Police analysts began to look deeper. They noticed links that did not show up in normal checks. A building company appeared again and again, always just outside the center of the activity. The company had recently taken on work connected to the iconic structure. Renovation permits had been filed, and contractors were seen coming and going at odd hours. Still, nothing illegal stood out. The paperwork was clean, and inspections showed no violations. What made investigators uneasy was the lack of mistakes. Criminal activity often leaves small cracks, but here everything lined up too neatly. Bills were paid on time. Staff records matched. Security cameras worked, yet showed nothing interesting. The building seemed calm, almost empty at times. Despite claims of ongoing work, that calm became suspicious. Surveillance began quietly. Officers watched from a distance, blending into the steady flow of tourists and commuters. Days passed with no clear sign of wrongdoing. Then weeks. The building remained closed to the public, but no heavy construction ever seemed to happen. Materials arrived in small amounts and left just as quietly. No one stayed long. It was as if the site existed only to justify movement, not progress. At the same time, the financial trail continued to pulse. More small sums appeared, always spaced carefully apart. Each one was legal on its own. Together, they suggested control and planning. Analysts traced the flow back toward the waterfront again and again. Every path seemed to end near the same address. The idea that such a famous place could hide something serious felt almost impossible. That disbelief worked in its favor. No one wanted to believe that crime could live inside a symbol of the city. Yet history showed that criminals often relied on that exact belief. Familiar places lowered suspicion. Respectable locations discouraged questions. As the weeks went on, police grew certain that the building was not just nearby, but involved. Still, they had no clear cause to enter. No alarms had been triggered. No witness had come forward. Everything depended on patience. Investigators waited for a mistake, a delay, or a sudden change in pattern. Then one detail shifted. A scheduled inspection was postponed without explanation. Shortly after, financial activity paused for the first time in months. The steady rhythm stopped. That silence felt louder than any alarm. It suggested someone inside knew they were close. The landmark remained standing, unchanged to the public eye. But beneath its calm surface, something was tightening, ready to break. The pause in activity did not last long, but it changed how investigators viewed the case. When the money flow returned, it came back altered. The deposits were smaller and spread farther apart. New accounts appeared, each lasting only days before going quiet. This shift suggested fear, not caution. Someone had noticed the pressure building and was trying to adapt. Analysts widened their focus beyond banks and companies. They began studying patterns of movement instead of names. Vans linked to different businesses followed similar routes. Devices connected to unrelated workers showed up near the same locations at the same times. None of it was illegal on its own, but together it formed a shape that could not be ignored. The network did not rely on one leader or one method. It relied on separation. Money laundering often leaves a human trace, and this case was no different. A community charity emerged as a key piece of the puzzle. On the surface, it supported local repair projects and heritage preservation. Its events were well attended, and its public records showed steady donations. The charity had strong ties to the waterfront and praised the restoration of historic buildings. It looked respectable, even admirable. Behind that image, the numbers told a different story. Donations arrived in clusters that matched the same rhythm seen in the bank deposits. Funds left the charity under vague expense categories, often marked as emergency repairs or specialist services. The amounts were always just below the level that would require extra review. The paperwork followed the rules while bending their spirit. The iconic building appeared again, this time as a beneficiary of the charity's funds. Payments were made for work that never fully appeared. Inspections showed fresh paint and minor fixes, but nothing that matched the scale of spending. The money was being justified, not used. That raised a troubling possibility. The building was not just connected to the network, it might be part of the system itself. Police suspected the network had moved away from storing money digitally. Cash avoided records and delays. It also demanded safe places, and safe places were rare. A famous building offered protection through attention. People assumed it was watched, managed and regulated. In reality, age and complexity worked against close oversight. Old sites often relied on trust rather than constant checks. The investigation uncovered another twist. Several shell companies linked to the charity shared directors who had no visible income. These individuals moved often and kept low profiles. None had criminal records. They existed on paper and little else. Their purpose was to appear normal long enough to pass money through. As the picture grew clearer, the scale of the operation became harder to ignore. This was not a small local scheme. The careful timing, the layered structure, and the use of respected institutions pointed to experience. The network had learned from past failures. It avoided greed and attention. It accepted slower gains in exchange for safety. What unsettled investigators most was how calm everything remained. No sudden withdrawals, no panic sales. Even after the brief pause, the system continued with discipline. That suggested strong internal control. Someone was guiding decisions, adjusting strategy, and keeping everyone aligned without leaving a trace. The building on the waterfront stood at the center of this invisible web. It connected money, movement, and image. From the outside it remained unchanged. Inside it was becoming more important with every discovery. Police now believed that cash was being held somewhere nearby, waiting for the right moment to move again. By the time surveillance increased, the network had already begun shifting weight. Some accounts closed, others opened under new names. The charity announced new plans and new partnerships. Everything looked busy and hopeful, yet beneath that activity ran the same hidden current, quiet and controlled, flowing back toward the same stone walls that had watched the city for generations. Pressure reached a point where waiting was no longer enough. Authorities needed a lawful reason to step inside the building without alerting anyone connected to it. The opportunity arrived through routine process, rather than sudden action. An updated safety review had become mandatory for historic properties undergoing claimed renovation. The paperwork filed months earlier now required verification. The timing felt accidental, but it was the result of patient planning. Attention turned to the service areas. Old buildings often hide paths designed for cables, heating, and ventilation. Many of these routes fall out of use and disappear from modern plans. One section of the building showed signs of alteration. A panel had been resealed with newer material that blended well but aged differently. It was subtle, easy to miss, and placed where no visitor would ever look. When the panel was removed, a narrow cavity appeared. It ran deeper than expected, extending along the inner wall. The space was dry and carefully maintained. Inside, wrapped tightly and stacked with precision, were bundles of cash. Each package was marked only by size and position. There were no labels, no fingerprints, and no signs of haste. The count reached £60,000, all in used notes, all sorted. The discovery confirmed long-held suspicions but also raised new questions. The amount was significant, yet not extreme. It suggested this was not a final storage point. Instead, it was a holding space, part of a larger cycle. The cash looked recent. There was no sign of decay or long-term storage. This money had been placed there with intention and was meant to move again. Forensic teams worked methodically. The cavity showed signs of repeated access. The panel had been opened and resealed multiple times. The work was skilled, likely done by someone familiar with construction standards. This was not a crude hiding place. It was designed to survive inspection, time, and attention. As word of the find spread through the investigation team, the building's role shifted from suspect to centerpiece. The choice of location now made sense. Its iconic status discouraged invasive searches. Its age provided cover for irregular layouts. Its ongoing renovation justified movement in and out without raising questions. Further inspection revealed more subtle signs. Foot traffic patterns suggested certain areas were used more than others, despite being officially closed. Security systems had blind spots that lined up perfectly with service routes. These details did not exist by chance. They pointed to careful planning and insider knowledge. The biggest surprise came from what was not found. There were no drugs, no weapons, and no obvious tools. The space held only money and the marks of control. This absence showed confidence. The network trusted its structure enough to separate risk. Cash stayed here. Other activities happened elsewhere. The discovery triggered a shift in pace. Warrants were prepared for linked properties. Financial monitoring intensified. The quiet face of the investigation ended. Centerpiece. The choice of location now made sense. Its iconic status discouraged invasive searches. Its age provided cover for irregular layouts. Its ongoing renovation justified movement in and out without raising questions. Further inspection revealed more subtle signs. Foot traffic patterns suggested certain areas were used more than others, despite being officially closed. Security systems had blind spots that lined up perfectly with service routes. These details did not exist by chance. They pointed to careful planning and insider knowledge. The biggest surprise came from what was not found. There were no drugs, no weapons, and no obvious tools. The space held only money and the marks of control. This absence showed confidence. The network trusted its structure enough to separate risk. Cash stayed here. Other activities happened elsewhere. The discovery triggered a shift in pace. Warrants were prepared for linked properties. Financial monitoring intensified. The quiet face of the investigation ended. The network had been exposed, even if it did not yet know it. Outside, life along the waterfront continued unchanged. Tourists took photos, ferries crossed the river. The building stood as it always had, solid and proud. Inside, however, its walls had given up their secret. What was once just suspicion now had weight, value, and proof. The hidden cash was no longer invisible, and the system that placed it there had begun to unravel. Once the hidden cash was secured, the investigation moved with speed and precision. Authorities understood that hesitation would give the network time to adapt or disappear. Coordinated searches were planned across the city, all timed to happen within hours of each other. The goal was to prevent warnings from spreading and to capture the system as it truly operated. Properties linked through financial records, transport data, and digital traces were entered almost simultaneously. None contained dramatic scenes or obvious criminal tools. Instead, each site offered small pieces of a larger puzzle. Laptops held spreadsheets without names. Phones were stripped of messages but still showed patterns of use. Filing cabinets contained invoices that looked correct until compared line by line. Everything was designed to appear ordinary. The most damaging evidence came from the charity that had once seemed untouchable. Its offices were calm and professional, filled with promotional material and community awards. Yet deeper review revealed parallel records hidden within backup systems. These files showed adjusted totals, delayed entries, and rerouted payments. The charity had functioned as a filter, cleaning money by wrapping it in public good. Attention turned to the people behind the paperwork. Several administrators claimed limited roles, supported by carefully shaped job descriptions. One position stood out. A compliance officer had full access to accounts and reporting tools, yet rarely appeared in public-facing material. The role existed to reassure regulators while quietly reshaping data. This access explained how the network stayed ahead of scrutiny for so long. As arrests began, another twist emerged. The operation did not rely on loyalty or fear. Instead, it used distance. Individuals knew only their narrow task. No one handled both cash and records. No one saw the entire flow. This structure limited exposure but also created weak points. Once the center was compromised, the edges collapsed quickly. The iconic building became a focal point of evidence. Maintenance logs were re-examined and matched against access records. Certain names appeared repeatedly during periods when cash movement increased. These workers were not criminals in the usual sense. They followed instructions, completed tasks, and asked few questions. The network exploited routine labor to protect itself. Financial freezes followed. Accounts connected to shell companies were locked before funds could move. Vehicles were seized for inspection. Digital forensics uncovered scheduling patterns that matched cash placement and removal from the building. The £60,000 found earlier was no longer just money. It became a timestamp, marking when the network felt safe enough to store value in stone. Public reaction grew as news spread. The idea that a respected landmark had played a role in crime unsettled many. Officials emphasized that the building itself was not to blame. Its history had been used, not damaged. That distinction mattered. The network thrived on borrowed trust, not destruction. As the final pieces fell into place, the scale of the operation became clear. This was not an impulsive scheme. It was a patient system built over years, refined through caution and restraint. Its downfall came not from greed, but from overconfidence. The belief that complexity alone could guarantee safety proved false. By the end of the operation, the network no longer functioned. Accounts were silent. Front organizations dissolved. The charity closed its doors. Its image permanently altered. What remained was a clear record of how control, patience, and ordinary routines had been turned into tools of crime. The building on the waterfront stood unchanged, but its role in the story was complete. With the network dismantled, the focus shifted from the immediate arrests to understanding the full scope of the operation. Investigators sifted through records, tracing every transaction and movement connected to the £60,000. What became clear was that the cash found hidden in the iconic building was only a small part of a much larger system. It had been a test, a temporary holding point, a signal that the network was active and adaptable. The money itself was significant, but its true value was in what it revealed. Digital forensics became a central tool. Devices recovered from the charity, shell companies, and linked individuals contained fragments of schedules, emails, and encrypted notes. Piecing these together revealed the full flow of cash, its origins, its destinations, and the careful steps taken to avoid detection. Analysts could map supplier chains, identify distribution points, and anticipate what had been intended as future moves. The network had relied on speed and secrecy, but it had underestimated the persistence of patient investigation. Beyond financial data, investigators also uncovered patterns in physical logistics. Vehicles used to transport small amounts of money were ordinary in appearance, but traveled precise routes. Timing was calculated to avoid surveillance and pedestrian traffic. Each stop, no matter how brief, was recorded in hidden ledgers that connected workers and locations without ever using full names. The system depended on anonymity, compartmentalization, and discipline. Each individual involved knew just enough to perform a task, and no more, minimizing exposure while maintaining control. The £60,000 itself was symbolic. It represented the first tangible proof that had turned suspicions into certainty. The discovery allowed investigators to coordinate simultaneous raids and seize additional assets. Without it, the network might have continued operating quietly, hidden in plain sight. It became a catalyst that revealed how trust and reputation had been weaponized. A building that symbolized stability and history was leveraged to shield criminal activity. The most striking lesson was how ordinary environments could conceal extraordinary operations. As authorities finalized the case, attention turned to community impact. The charity was dissolved, and its remaining funds were redirected to legitimate projects under strict oversight. The network's influence over local services and construction had been extensive, and restoring integrity required careful planning. Public awareness campaigns explained how fraud could infiltrate well-regarded institutions and reminded people that legitimacy on the surface did not guarantee transparency beneath. The building itself remained, its walls unchanged, but now under closer observation. Renovation plans continued, but inspectors were vigilant. The hidden cavity that had once held the cash was sealed permanently. Lessons from the investigation reshaped citywide procedures, particularly in historic structures where complex layouts could mask irregular activity. Security measures and routine audits were strengthened, with awareness that prevention required diligence as much as enforcement. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the case was how the network's collapse was not driven by a single dramatic discovery or confrontation. It was patience, data analysis, and a careful sequence of legal steps that brought it down. By the time arrests were made and assets frozen, the system had already begun to unravel internally. Individuals who had thought they were invisible suddenly faced scrutiny, and the careful compartmentalization that once protected them became a liability. In the end, the story of the £60,000 was less about the money and more about control. It revealed how human ingenuity, trust, and routine could be manipulated to shield illicit operations. Yet it also showed that methodical investigation, persistence, and attention to detail could overcome even the most carefully constructed networks. Liverpool's landmark stood as a reminder that appearances can deceive, but diligence and patience eventually uncover the truth. The case closed with lessons that extended far beyond one building, highlighting the fragile line between trust and exploitation, and the power of persistence to expose